Catrice McLeod here, and today I am interviewing Rob from Flail Forward about his awesome game, Ashes of the Magi.
Hey, how's it going?
Well, pretty good, especially since we're finally talking about this after, we've been talking like over half an hour and we haven't even... We're good at this, so anyway.
Yes.
First off, let's actually start with the basic premise of the setting. And more specifically, the part that's going to get people really wound up. The whole apocalypse spells thing. Like, what are they? Like, give an example and why this matters to the game's setting and its outcome.
Okay. The apocalypse spell. So, Ashes of the Magi takes place in the direct aftermath of the equivalent of a full-scale magical nuclear exchange, right? So these are spells that affected entire cities, and what happens in the direct aftermath of this, so the players each survive the direct effect of one of these spells, and in doing so, they are granted the ability to see the strands of fate, which is a deeper level of magic than any other people have access to. And this gives them the ability to predict the future to some extent, or at least see multiple possible futures all at the same time, and then pick a path down which they can sort of nudge reality. And so these are the player characters, and these player characters act as force multipliers for other people. So as a player in Ashes of the Magi, you control a troop of characters rather than just one character. So you all act in relative sync. It matters most during combat. So it's the combat is a sort of a tactical squad-based, almost wargame-ish, but it isn't very heavy on the simulation. So a lot of it's abstracted out in order to make the narrative sort of the overarching point of each combat. So the combats are not like a random dungeon encounter or a tavern brawl or something like that. They are like set pieces in a movie where there's a lot of people fighting all at the same time. Like, the player characters will often face down small armies, or really large, big, nasty creatures, and be the only ones in their general vicinity that have any hope of defeating such a challenge.
Okay, so I'm not sure if this is going to make this really easy or really difficult, because you just nailed like the first 4 questions in a row.
Okay.
You just, like, I get the feeling that if I just asked you, so like, what's the game about, and just went quiet for half an hour, I could come back and you'd basically have finished the interview.
Well, at this point in the game's like development, I have a really good sense of what it's about and what my goals are and the experience I want to provide with it.
Yeah, which is really good. So, actually, I think I'm going to go back a little bit and try to focus on some of these on an individual basis, because they're really interesting. So, Okay.
Thanks. Yeah.
The whole, basically, it's the end of the world. This is the apocalypse had already happened, essentially. Like, everybody just kind of went nuts and was like, oh shit, they're launching their nuclear spells, and I guess we should probably do ours too. And it just kind of turned into a mess, and each of these cities got hit with something different.
Yeah, and also it's the case that some nations just use this as an excuse to let theirs off at somebody who'd been bugging them for a while, and sort of claim it was preemptive. So yeah, there's a lot of strife in the aftermath. Like, none of these places. Everybody's paranoid now. So that's the first thing. You're dropped into this sort of realm of very much everybody for themselves, at this point, because everybody's just worried about who they can trust.
Well, yeah, it kind of makes sense. You're basically playing in magical Fallout at this point.
Mm-hmm.
Like,
yeah,
the nukes have gone off. It's not. It was bad enough that it was like the Cold War. Everyone was paranoid of what would happen if. Now it's like, it's not if anymore. It actually has happened. We know people are willing to pull the trigger now.
Yeah.
Now we have to be even more scared whether they're willing to pull it again.
Yeah. So that's one of the things you may address as players of this game. What was the question?
Actually, the question I'm going to focus on here at the moment is, could you actually give an example of one or two of these apocalypse spells?
Sure.
Just because they really are kind of interesting, the examples you've come up with.
Yeah, so one of the ones that's in the book already is one where a kilometer wide sheet of flame was launched at a city, and that city's wards held it at bay, but it didn't, since all that flame is actually material, so it's akin to something like burning oil. It just sort of sat over the ward. There was so much of it that it just sort of covered the city, and everybody tried to get inside and use their magic to dissipate the heat that was coming in. It created this convection current that just started roasting everything in the city alive, and eventually started melting the sand outside. Some people survived that had the best magic, but just the entire city's glass now, so just cracking, creaking, falling apart, and also filled with the dead that walk as well, so that are perhaps still burning from the inside or covered in shards of glass. And so that's one example. Another example is one where all the trees in the vicinity grew to enormous size. So, they aged something like 1,000 years in the space of an hour. And they grew so big, they all just crowded each other out and started tipping over. And so now there's a city that's just a crisscross of enormous broken logs, and people are just sort of hacking into them and making shelter in the sides of these enormous trees. So it turns into like this sort of like little Ewok village has crushed a city. So that's another example. And so then there's just a bunch. And then you also, and if you wish, you can just create your own. Obviously, there's enough empty space in the world that I've left that intentionally, so that people could drop their own crazy ideas in about what happens during the wrath.
Yeah, in a lot of these cases, like, it's not just that they're big, flashy, powerful things. A lot of the times it's just something that would be relatively innocuous is just taken to its logical conclusion. Like, I know the first one that I read about when I was reading through your game was the one where people just basically had anything that was like seeds or whatever just grew, which is not good if you happen to eat seeds recently.
Yes, yeah, exactly.
That'd be a very unpleasant way to go. It's like, that's a horrible thing to have happen, but it's like, it seems so innocuous. It's like we just, grow the seeds.
Germinated the seeds in whatever medium they happen to be in. It's like, the human stomach. Great. Yeah.
It's like, that's horrifying.
Yeah.
But it's like, this is the whole kind of thing. It's like these entire cities just basically got wiped off the map. Like, smaller towns, not quite as much, which is actually kind of reasonable when you consider, like, how a Fallout situation would happen. Like,
yeah,
but they rely on the larger cities for trade and resources, and they send like their caravan out like they normally do, and then they come back and it's like, why didn't you bring any food back? And it's like, it's not there. What? The city, it's not there anymore.
Yeah, or everybody's dead, and the city is now filled with, you know, these spirits that are locked in these rotting bodies, just trying to get out. You know, but that's the grave. So the graveless dead are a sort of ubiquitous feature in the world, and what they are is the souls didn't leave to the next world, and so they're stuck inside these things, and pretty much only the reptile brain is in control now. So it's just attack things, attack anything that's in front of you and eat it. And even though they don't need sustenance anymore, then they're just these rotting shells, or desiccated shells, depending on the climate. So yeah, the zombie apocalypse is definitely a part of the game, although it's only a small slice of it. The Grayless Dead, once the players get a little competent, really don't present that much of a problem, except in enormous hordes.
Well, you did mention that you will be fighting armies. Now, that's actually something that I do particularly love, is when the setting does something interesting, but then the fluff and the crunch, like the setting's concepts and all those parts actually work their way into the mechanics. Now, you've done this like all over really well.
Thank you.
Especially with like the Magi, for example. Like, you literally have a pretty good reason why there are player characters, and why the player characters actually can make a pretty big impact on the world. So you mentioned part of it briefly already, like the whole concept that the Magi can basically act as force multiplier. They can actually see the future of what's going to happen. They're not necessarily that much stronger than normal individuals.
Right.
And the party that they're working with, same thing. They're probably above average, but they're not like godlike powerful or anything. So how is like a team of like, say, 15, 16 people wiping out a whole army? So how do you actually go about doing this?
So the first thing is like normal people in Ashes of the Magi, like statistically, don't roll any dice, right? So what the dice represent in this case are the sort of constant tweaking of fate and probability that the War Magi are doing every time their party does something. So the dice represent the chance to go above what people are normally capable of, but that only happens because the player characters are pulling the strings of their party. And then if they really focus and really warp reality quite a bit, they can re-roll dice or reduce their target numbers, or they can explode criticals. So there's a lot of ways in which you can manipulate the dice pool by reaching into the world and tweaking fate. And then in order to replenish, so to do that, you're spending weird, which is you have at the start of the game 3 points of this, and you can spend that to either lower the target number, reroll dice, or explode criticals. And when you spend them, they go away. They become a force called Dread. And then in order to get those points back and be able to spend them again, at the end of a round, you can choose to face Dread. And when you do so, you grab back a number of points equal to your maximum, if you want, up to your maximum, and then roll that many dice. And everybody else at the table who is getting points back is also rolling dice. and then you all compare dice. And if you have any doubles or triples, then something unfavorable happens to those characters. So like the environment twists on you in a bad way, or an enemy gets in a lucky shot and you sustain an injury, or the ubiquitous fog that's in the game like rises and it becomes actually hard to see past a certain point. And so there's different ways that the tactical situation in the combat can change just based on that. And but all that is tied to the idea that these characters are actually reaching into the gears of fate and pulling levers, you know.
Yeah, so this actually leads to a number of questions I do want to ask, and all of them are shorter to do this. First one, I think the most important one actually is one thing that you've done in your game that very, very few games have tried to do. And that's the idea that you mentioned you start with 3 points of weird at the start of the game. Mm-hmm. But there are some major things that start changing in the middle of the game that even the GM doesn't know about. It's
right.
You basically described it as essentially an envelope that has hidden rule changes that after a certain point in the plot, like, the GM gets to find out, oh, that's interesting.
Yeah, so the idea comes from legacy board games, so like Risk Legacy and Pandemic Legacy, where there's an experience of certain triggers have you open envelopes and unpack rules changes at certain points in the game. And what's interesting about that is these rule changes the way I use them is I signify a shift in perspective of the characters. And what was difficult about sort of coming up with ones that, because in like Pandemic Legacy, for example, this isn't a spoiler, except for, yeah, it's not a spoiler. This is the thing that happens in like the first time you open the game up. Is you're told that one of the diseases can no longer be cured. Now, if you played Pandemic beforehand, you know that in order to win the game, you have to cure all the diseases. But the first thing that happens in Pandemic Legacy is you open an envelope and say, oh, this disease is incurable. And now you go, whoa, no, now what? So now there's a disease we can't cure, so are these cards for this color worth nothing anymore? Like, okay, so they're just used for travel now. Like, okay, it's kind of interesting. It just changes how certain elements of the game are valued relative to each other. And to do that in Ashes, I couldn't do anything where I would know that there's a plot shift, or I had to make it occurrences that would happen in every game of Ashes of the Magi, regardless of what the players were doing. And so the way it works is they're all triggered off of certain random happenstances of like, generally they're weird triggers. So like the first one of the ones you can open early is like the first time you recover more dread than your maximum, one opens and a new rule is revealed about how that works and what it does and what the consequences are and stuff like that. So for an RPG, I don't think this has been done yet because it's not really, it uses a board game mechanic. So it's like this is only a revelation to the players the first time it happens, right? So if they're playing a different game of Ashes of the Magi later, they know this is going to happen. So really, it's I don't know. It maybe only enhances the experience for the first time through, and then you kind of know it. But
well, it doesn't, because one of the key points of the game is that with the weird, your Magi can actually see the future, so it's built into the game. It's just your future characters that you play have a little bit more knowledge than the previous ones.
Yeah, that's true. Yeah,
it's a little bit strange that you essentially have almost like roguelike elements built into a board.
An
tabletop
RPG,
role playing
yeah.
game. Yeah.
Yeah, a little bit, but they're all, the point of them is that they introduce a common element of a larger, I don't know, it's not really a meta narrative, but it's sort of like the place of the characters in the world sort of is designed to expand. And I use those legacy elements as the sort of gateways for that.
Okay, that actually provides like a good segue here. That, how they expand their influence in the world, they also expand their influence among their allies. Like when you start out, you have like the Magi itself, that's like your player character, but you also start snowballing a little bit and picking up allies. Like you get an actual squad of people to work with. It's not a very large squad, but because you have multiple characters that are all working together, you can hyper specialize, you can spread yourself out, you can basically do a few different things with this, and your Magi is basically the one that's in charge of trying to keep everything making sense. So care to elaborate on this a bit further than I did?
Yeah, so one of the elements that's been in this game throughout its various iterations is the squad mechanics. So I just thought I like games like what's a recent one? Darkest Dungeon, right? Where you are creating like you're handling an RPG party, or even the Final Fantasy games where you're handling a full RPG party, and you kind of are when you have like different party members to choose from, you can sort of like skew your party in one direction or generalize, and that's a good strategy, or like you said, hyper specialize. And I like that dynamic as a game thing, and been trying to figure out how to make it work in an RPG, but one of the difficult things is like, how do you do it in such a way that it's not handing the player just 4 characters and saying, well, here's your party. Like I had to make it more cohesive than that, and more unified than that. So each character contributes. So it's a dice pool system. Each character contributes dice, and you roll them all at once. And so and each action, generally speaking, resolves in one roll of the dice. So it's not even damage doesn't usually resolve on a dice roll unless it's a spell. So I wanted to keep the game flowing quickly, despite the fact that you're managing up to 4 characters. So it's the War Mage plus 3 others there. And the reason it's that is because that's like the practical limits of attention, because you're manipulating fate for 3 other people plus yourself, and that's about what a human being can keep track of. Like they're just, beyond that, and it starts getting difficult.
The tricky part in gameplay, like this is a role-playing game, having 4 different personalities to keep track of, a lot of people have problems keeping track of one. So how have you actually dealt with that, short of just telling the GM, like, okay, you're gonna role-play like, the 3 characters for every person in the game. There's like 4 players, and that's like a dozen extra.
Yeah.
So how did you actually do this?
So the way I do it is that the players get to role play their War Mage and then all the other people in their party. And the way I keep it from getting out of control is each of these characters has 3 traits that are sort of the things you notice about them most, and that includes profession and nationality, and it can include upbringing, like if they're religious or not, and so those help the players keep their mind on the differences. And what's been nice about it in playtests is that the players really enjoy having like amusing inter-party conflicts with themselves. Saying one character goes off and like just starts opening barrels of wine, and that's like, oh, that's classic shitface or whatever his name. There was a character, I think it was a rot mage, that somebody just called shitface, and he was just the butt of the party. He was just like, he was the asshole in the group. And, you know, it was just a funny thing that happened, but so far that hasn't really been an issue. Like, people kind of like I don't know if it's like the general culture is just sort of adapted to the point where people can picture a party of adventurers now, like, and that's no issue. But it's and one of the ways it is as it is mechanically is so that each player can has the opportunity to participate in the maximum number of scenarios. So if you are trying to infiltrate a place, you can each send your sneaky guy to go on and do a thing, and everybody can be participating in a sort of stealth type mission. Or if it's a magic type thing and everybody needs to participate in a ritual, you can go send your mage to go help with the ritual and participate in that scene. Or if it's the kind of thing where it's a diplomatic scene, you each have a talkie guy that can contribute. So it's all about maximizing the number of scenarios in which players can participate without everybody being a contrived Mary Sue type character. Like, all these things are split up amongst different people, and you have the opportunity to not include those kinds of people, but it's a choice you're making at that point. Like, and it's really hard actually to create a group that's bad at any one of those things. Like, you're probably going to have a guy that's sneaky. You're probably going to have a guy that's good at talking. You're probably going to have a guy that's more tanky. You're probably going to have a guy that's better at magic. Like, so it's set up that way on purpose so that you can participate in the maximum number of things.
Okay, so moving on to the next question then. So I'm probably going to ask this question to probably everyone in some way, shape, or form. So what's the overall balance in Ashes of the Magi between the narrative and the gameplay elements? Like, which ones does it stand out as having greater control of what's going on?
I tend to come down on the narrative side of things. And the way I support that is all the mechanics are there to support something in the fiction. So fiction first is one of the principles that I built this game around. So how you play it is you describe what you're doing, and then you reach into the game's toolkit to figure out the answer. And because I need to be able to cover anything the players could conceivably say, the mechanics are broad and easy to apply to new situations. Like, I avoid like a lot of lists of specific things. There's not a lot in terms of fiddly mechanics or modifiers that I have players deal with. Like, the only modifiers on your dice pools are basically adding more dice that generate power, or adding dice that take power, subtract from your overall power. And so everything, like, there doesn't have to be any math before or after the roll. You're just adding dice to the pool. And seeing if you beat the threshold of your task. So it's the mechanics are doing their best not to step on the narrative that the players are guiding the game down. The mechanics are there to support the narrative and help the players arrive at interesting answers to questions, I would say.
Honestly, I think most RPGs should be doing that, because like the whole concept is try to describe what you're doing, and how does the game let you actually do the thing that you're trying to do. Yeah. I find it really weird when you get the reverse where the game just tells you, okay, you're going to do this thing now, and here's the mechanics. And it's like, what if I want to do this other thing? And it's like, no, you're doing the thing I just told you to do.
Right. Yeah.
So
I mean,
it's kind of weird.
It is kind of weird, but like, people, it's easy to fall into the trap of like trying to describe every possible conceivable action with a specific mechanic that does something really different. Because I abstract a lot at a high level, like I don't have to take into account tripping mechanics or grappling mechanics or anything like that. It's squad on squad combat. So when you're clashing with another unit, I abstract all that out into one overall assault roll that represents 30 seconds of combat. So it's a lot can be going on in there, and you can describe it however you want. And there's still like effects you can choose. So some things you can do with assault roll is move into that enemy's space at the end. So that represents, a move where you're trying to, like a charge, or where you're trying to gain ground, for example. Like if they're holding something and you want to gain ingress to it, like be that a keep or like a bridge or something like that, that can represent you like getting among their ranks and now they've got problems. Like they can either back off and try and defend themselves better, or they can try and hold it and like be in sort of a meat grinder situation. Or you can, push somebody out or push somebody back with combat. There's things that can represent various sort of high-level squad afflictions that are very simple to apply, but I don't have to account for very specific actions like, how does blinding work in my game? Like my game doesn't care about that in combat. It's like if somebody's blinded, and it's good. It's as good as a wound, essentially. It hampers the fighting ability of the squad in the same way.
Okay, right. Now, you had mentioned earlier that you basically got pretty clearly defined goals at this point. And they probably changed from where you started out, but
oh yeah.
The question at this point is, you have these goals. Have you actually managed to meet all of the goals, or are there any that you're still struggling a little bit with, do you think?
It's not that I'm struggling to meet the goals anymore. It's that I'm struggling to make certain parts of the game conform to them. So the goals of the game are largely maximize player engagement at any stage possible, and tell a compelling story. And the tricky part is to make sure the mechanics and the narrative can do those two things at the same time. Because, and I think if I'm being honest, like I think the maximize engagement thing will inevitably lead to the second one. And so that's all about moving player agency to the central concern. So one of the big drastic changes I've kind of made in terms of role-playing design is giving authorial control of the, for lack of a better word, adventures to the players, right? So the guide, my GM, doesn't create adventures ahead of time. What they do is they have pieces in the game that will entice the players to go act. One of the changes is also that the guide does not pass out experience. The players give themselves experience for doing things in the world that they have declared will give them experience. So the players get to set how they gain experience, and then when that experience gain happens. And so they control the pace of their advancement. So as long as they're doing things in the world that comport with the things they set out at campaign and character creation, then they advance. And so there's a great incentive in the game for players to be proactive. But to do that, I have to give the guide all the tools right up front in order to sort of lay the track as the players are going down it. And so that's the part where right now I'm still like really working through that. Like, how do I give the guides the all the tools to quickly and effectively lay down track as the players are, careening down it. And so that's what I'm working on right now. So like all the player stuff, I'm pretty happy with at this point. I'm pretty happy with the mechanics. I'm pretty happy with how the characters come together, how easy they are to manage and play. I'm pretty happy with all that stuff so far, and now it's like the GM side of the guide side of it I'm trying to design this next part of the book to support them as much as I've supported the players.
Yeah, I think that's one of the biggest issues in role-playing games up until now, but there's a lot of people, especially within our group in Flail Forward, that are realizing that the GM or whatever you want to call them, the one who's basically in charge of, making sure the narrative works fine, they if you have a really good GM, then even a game with terrible rules, terrible setting, whatever, they'll still find a way to make it awesome for their players.
Yeah.
But if you don't have a GM who knows how to do that, they don't know how to lay the track, as you put it, they're going to run into all sorts of problems. So actually teaching them how to be a good GM is kind of integral to having the game be able to be playable at all at this point. And I think we're only just starting to get into realizing that.
Yeah, completely agree. I think the last couple of years that's been more emphasized than it has been. I think with the Powered by the Apocalypse games and like Forged in the Dark games and some of the other more modern games have catered more to that side of play, specifically with advice and so forth. Like, here's what you do, here's ways to make it interesting. And I'm in the middle of doing my version of that, and the talking with all you guys has been instrumental in like working out my own thoughts as to how that should go. But I'm still in the middle of it, so I can't really say how exactly it's going to go. What I am trying to do is make it easy, and make it such that the guide is focused on helping the players manage the narrative and not at all concerned with work outside of the game. So I need it to be able to deliver, like if the players are it's obvious that they're going to get into a combat, I need to make the game able to deliver a fun and challenging encounter very easily and with a minimal amount of bookkeeping, such that the guide can just pull out a sheet of paper, write down 9 numbers, and they're good to go. So that's the challenge, like making that easy and making the world expand as the players move into it is the challenge, and also keeping that coherent and interesting, and also not doing it with a bunch of random charts. That's actually proving trickier than I'd like, but I think I'm wearing away at it.
Yeah, it's always one of those things that it sounds so simple in your head, and then you actually try to do it, and it's like, this is a lot harder than I thought it would be. It's
Yeah.
the parts that you thought were going to be difficult. Yeah, they're still difficult, but
Yeah.
but the parts, but the parts that really stump you are the ones that you didn't even think were going to be a problem.
Mm-hmm.
But
Yeah. It's kind of like, because I'm also trying to write like the way I've come to learn how to GM as I've done it, and because my GMing style is effective because players come back, and I'm trying to figure out how to codify like my best practices, because like, you know, Ashes is a game I designed, so it's designed to sort of dovetail with my best practices, and a lot of my best practices are improvising the track in, you know, that's getting laid in front of the players, and I'm trying to figure out how to codify that and deliver it to somebody such that they can do it too, and that's proved to be pretty tricky also, but like I said, I'm chipping away at it.
from what I've seen of your design, like, I'm no doubt that you'll get there sooner or later. Probably later from the sounds of it, but you will get there. I have no doubt of that. So, with that in mind, there's one more major thing I'd want to point out, but we can't really use it as a question that really works, because it's like, it's related to some really awesome artwork you've managed to get set up for the game, but well, Ashes has its own very particular and unique feel to it, but it's hard to describe it in words. It's kind of the sort of thing that you'd have to see. So, to that end, do you have any kind of early access testing for any of the listeners here?
Yeah. So you can find me on Facebook, at Ashes of the Magi on Facebook and Twitter and Instagram, and you can get to the Discord page from there, and on Discord I have the playtest document just open for anybody who wants to read it and give feedback. It's pretty big at this point, and it's still going through a lot of changes. But if you want to get a feel for what the final product could look like, it's there. And there's some art, some of it original, a lot of it is placeholder at the moment. But I'm filling it in as I go.
Okay. One final question.
And I was just going to say, yeah, and to your point about the feel is, I don't know, the feel is like psychedelic black metal. I don't know, like it's definitely fantasy, but it's maybe not the standard kind. It's
really not. It's one of those things that, yeah, you have to actually see it. So yeah, you totally follow the links. I'll be putting them into the low bar. Follow the links. Go take a look at Ashes of the Magi for yourself. So, final question, while I think of it, is what stage of development do you think you would define Ashes of the Magi in right now? Like, is it midway through beta testing, late alpha stages, pre-alpha even? Like, where would you actually state it compared to, like, actually being ready for release?
I would say it's still late alpha. So I've done, even though the thing says beta, but like the main chunk of the mechanics are done. The setting is pretty solidified in my head. There's quite a bit of setting in the book already. The only part that remains to be done mechanically is to lay out what the guide does in certain situations. So right now the game is pretty much only runnable by me, because I know what the guide's supposed to be doing. So when it gets, so I'm hoping to have it finished by, I hope end of March, but that would be very favorable circumstances. More likely end of April. It'll be ready for like somebody to run without me present, and that's when the beta testing will begin in earnest. And I hope to have it ready for a Kickstarter by October. And to that end, I'm doing illustration for it, and I've got some artists on board. One piece already finished that you can see on the Facebook page, and I'm in the process of recruiting more artists and trying to figure out the manufacturing side of things. If I am to get a hardcover version of this, which I very much want to do, and yeah, that's about it.
Yep.
So it's late alpha, hopefully on the verge of going into full beta.
One final point there, then, while you mention it. I've actually seen some of Rob's artwork. It's actually really good quality stuff. Not the absolute best the world has ever seen, but it's by RPG standards, it's pretty good. So yeah, this is not just, oh, I threw some stick figures in, it's fine. So no, you're in for a little bit of a treat there. So
oh, thank you very much.
It's good. So with that out of the way, we basically covered everything that we need to cover. So any final words before we head off?
Yeah, thanks for having me, and thanks for the good questions.
All right, welcome. Thank you very much, and you can always catch us on Flail Forwards. So good night.
Night.